All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda. I'm the stewardship manager for Nanaimo and Area Land Trust, and I'm excited that we got Scott to come and speak to us about a project that we've been working a little bit with him. It's primarily been a project through your work, but he's collaborated with Nalt to a certain extent over the last 3 years. We've been going out putting acoustic recorders, and he's been processing all the data and sharing information with us. So we're really excited to hear about 3 years of work that he's been doing for us. So who is Scott? He is a recent transplant to Nanaimo from the mainland. And he's a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada and an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia. His research focuses on the ecology and conservation of species at risk, with an emphasis on bats and neotropical migratory birds. His work on these topics includes studies in coastal BC, Prairie Canada, and Colombia, Mexico. So I think that was a more recent addition to your area.
Oh, yeah.
We're really excited to have him. I also wanted to do a plug. If you're not a member of Nanaimo and Area Land Trust, I highly encourage you to become a member. Our membership numbers they help to amplify our voice vis-a-vis regional municipal government in terms of land protection and conservation efforts. And it's $10 for students and seniors, $20 for everyone else. And also I'm the Mid-Island coordinator for the BC Community Bat Program. So if you're interested in becoming a bat ambassador and participating in that program, just let me know, send me an email, and I'm passing it over to Scott. Thanks for coming, Scott.
Thanks, Linda. How's that volume? Is that okay? Sounds good. All right, haven't used one of these before.
I think that's gonna work for you. And you'll see yourself in that picture then.
Yeah, okay. Big one go forward, little one back, and then you said
Yep.
that's not gonna work. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's great to come and chat with you about conservation of bats and some of the work that Linda mentioned that we've been doing here on the island. So I'm gonna break this talk into 3 different parts. I'm gonna start with an overview of conservation issues for bats and some of the threats that they're experiencing, especially here in Canada, as well as the value of bats to ecosystems and people and why they're so important to conserve. I'll then go into the surveys, the acoustic surveys that we've been doing here over the past 3 years to better understand bats and their occurrence and abundance here in the east part of Vancouver Island. And then finally, I'll close with some of the research results and the findings that we're learning about bats and their habitat needs here on the island. So to start with conservation, this slide here comes from a report done by Bat Conservation International on the status of bats in North America. And these numbers on the right here show for each of the countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico, the status of bats, the number of species and their status, with orange or pinkish colors indicating bats that are at risk and blue colors indicating bats that are stable. And so in Canada, on the top there, you see that we have 17 species in the country, and only 3 of those at the moment are considered secure, with 14 of them at least vulnerable and 3 of them imperiled. It's a similar story in the United States. They have more species, more than twice as many species as us. But you can see that the majority of the species there are at least vulnerable as well. And then in Mexico, which has the most species, the condition or the situation is a little better, has a lot more secure species, at least as far as we know, based on the information. So if we look globally in terms of what are the threats that bats face, this is a study done by a review by Frick et al. in 2020 that looked at threatened species across the world. And so there's about 1,400 species of bats in the world, and about 200 of those are considered to be threatened. And so what this figure on the right shows is all of the reasons why those species were threatened. And so the 2 big ones that you can see there at the top of the chart logging and harvesting, so forestry, and agriculture are considered a threat for at least 50% of those species. And so this is really going to be habitat loss. That's the issue here. And this is a consistent issue for biodiversity worldwide. And then we go down to other threats that are a little bit influencing fewer species, but still prevalent. Things like hunting, so poaching is not so much of an issue in Canada, but it is in some parts of the world. Human disturbance, urban development, and so on. And so those top ones are, especially the first two, are probably an issue for Canadian species. But here in Canada, there's two threats in particular that have been especially problematic for our bats, and as to why so many of those species are considered vulnerable. And the first of these is an introduced disease called white nose syndrome that you may have heard of. So this was a disease introduced from Europe in about 2006. And it's thought to have come over on the equipment or the shoes of cavers. And it infects the caves of and bats that are hibernating colonially in large caves and in large colonies initially in the eastern part of the country. And these two figures here, or the two photos here on the left, show bats that have been infected by white nose syndrome and where the disease, the name, comes from. And so it's been especially impactful for these large, there are these Myotis species that hibernate in very large colonies, and has led to declines of about 90% or more in some populations in Eastern Canada and Eastern United States. Since it came over to New York, it has slowly spread west, infecting bat colonies in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. It was observed in Grand Forks, BC, was the first record of it about 2 years ago. And so far, it hasn't been shown up on the island. And we also don't know what effect it'll have when it comes to the island, if it gets here, because our winters are so much warmer, bats are not hibernating in these big colonies. So it's a real unknown as to what effect white nose will have here on the island and in coastal BC in general. But what we see here at present is state of the bats pre-white nose syndrome. And so the surveys I'm going to talk about kind of offer a baseline before this threat hits the island. The second issue that is a more recent one, but is of growing concern, is mortality from wind energy farms. And so what happens here is there's, as you've probably seen, a big increase in the amount of wind energy production across the country. And bats are dying in these farms, both because of mortality when they hit the blades, but also because of barotrauma, because there's a big pressure drop within the area of the blades, and that causes lung damage that ends up in killing a lot of bats. It's most severe for 3 species of migratory bats, or they're called migratory tree bats: hoary bat, silver-haired, and eastern red bat. And mainly when they're passing through these farms in fall migration. And some predictions, especially for hoary bats, suggest that we could lose 80 to 90% of populations because of this mortality. But it's an area of active research, and there's a lot of modeling going on, trying to figure out, how severe will this issue be. And the other thing there's a lot of work on is how do we trade off ceasing operations of these farms, or can we adjust the wind speeds at which the farms start to operate? Because bats are flying in low winds. These farms are not generating much energy when the winds are really low. So what is that trade-off where we can stop the turbines without losing too much energy production? So that's another big threat that we see here for bats in Canada. And again, not so much in this area, but especially in the prairies and some other areas. So because of those threats, I'm just going to go through where we're at for listing of bats as species at risk federally. So there are 3 species that are considered now listed as endangered under the Species at Risk Act. The little brown myotis, northern long-eared bat, and tricolored bat. These are the 3 species that were most strongly hit by white nose syndrome. And the listing, it was an emergency listing. It happened in, I think, 2014 because populations were declining so fast out east. And then there's the 3 species that I just mentioned that recommended as endangered by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada because of the risk of wind mortality, wind energy farm mortality. They're not actually listed yet. They're still going through the process. And then there's two more species that are considered threatened or special concern. These are lower categories. Pallid bat, which is threatened, and spotted bat, which is special concern. These are both BC bats, and they're found in the interior. They have fairly small distributions and small populations. They're mainly, or they're more common in the US. But because they have these small distributions, they're also listed under SARA. So, bit of a background there on the threats to bats here. Just talk about a little bit now about why bats are so valuable. And one of those reasons is that they're extremely important pollinators of a whole variety of plant species, both native species in the ecosystem, but also a number of species that we depend on. So this isn't in Canada, but bats are really important pollinators for banana, for guava, coconut, agave, mango. And so a lot of these farms are, and the produce that we see, it actually comes from bat pollination or depends on bats. Similarly, bats are really important for seed dispersal, and this includes both native dispersal of native species, so rainforest, a lot of rainforest plants depend on bats, but also economically important species. So bats are important for dispersing of figs and papayas and dates. And then here in North America, most of our bats are insect eaters. And the big advantage of bats is their value in insect control. A single bat can eat thousands of insects a night. And studies in the US have estimated that that actually can provide almost $4 billion worth of control to that benefits the agriculture industry. And so to my knowledge, that hasn't been looked at here in Canada. But you can think both for agriculture and forestry, they're providing a massive service to us in terms of the control that they provide for insects. And all of this is in addition to their value for maintaining healthy ecosystems, of course, right? Okay, so there's some background on conservation status and the value of bats. I'm going to turn over now to talking about the surveys that we did over the past few years. So as Linda mentioned, this was a collaboration with Nalt to use acoustic recordings to better understand the occurrence and abundance of bats here on the island. So why did we do this? There's several reasons. As I just mentioned, we did there's a lot that's not known about bats. Compared to, I've worked on migratory birds most of my life, and the bat switch to bats is a bit more recent. And we know so much less about bats in comparison to migratory birds. I'd say we're at where we were 30 years ago with birds in terms of understanding their habitat needs and their ecology and so on. And so part of it was just to better understand the distribution and abundance of bats here on the island. And then similarly, to use this information as a baseline that we can, for future monitoring of what's happening to our bat populations here. As I mentioned, this is pre-white nose. This is pre a lot of impacts likely on wind energy farms, depending on what kind of production starts to happen in this region. And so these kind of surveys give us that baseline from which to compare what happens as white nose spreads further west, for example. And then some research questions as well that we were interested in. We wanted to know how the local habitats and other like forest cover influence what bats are using in selecting their foraging sites. And finally, wanted to know a little bit about the value of protected areas for bats. Are bats more common, or are the number of species more common inside compared to outside of protected areas? So just summarize, go over some of the bats here on the island before getting into the results of the survey. So there are 9 regularly occurring bat species on Vancouver Island that were the focus of our surveys, and those are shown, those 9 on the left side of the slide. Many of these figures came from the book up in the top right there, Bats of British Columbia. Stefan also brought a copy here. If you're interested, this is an excellent book on everything bats in BC, ecology, conservation, behavior, life history. So it's a great book to get if you're interested. So we focused on those 9 species. As I mentioned, 3 of them are endangered or soon to be endangered in Canada, the little brown myotis in the top center, and then hoary bat and silver-haired bat on the left side. And then there's 2 other species that are considered accidental that have only recently been detected here on the island. On the right there, eastern red bat, they're common, they're not common, they're present in other parts of British Columbia, and there's a few records now of them on the island here. And then Brazilian free-tailed bat. This is a more southern species. It's common throughout Latin America and the southern US, but it's been detected on Salt Spring Island and, you know, maybe in other parts of the island as well. Now, I just want to comment a little about what broad habitat needs of bats during the summer period. So our surveys were conducted during the summer, and there's really 2 main needs that bats have at this time of year. They need roost sites and foraging sites. So during the day, bats are in their roost sites. Because of the time of year, for females with their pups, these are maternity roosts, which depending on the species can vary from solitary individuals or just a few individuals together to fairly large groups. For example, like these little brown myotis shown on the left here, and sometimes multiple species in these big colonies that you see. And so during the day, they're in their roost, they're protecting their pups. And then at night, of course, they go out and they're feeding in the environment and looking for insects. And so our surveys were focused on the foraging site, identifying kind of what they're using. Part of that is because the techniques used for identifying what's important and where they are when they're feeding at night are very different from what we need to use to find their roosts and identify kind of what types of habitats they're using for roost sites. We use acoustic recorders. It's a very productive way to identify where they are for foraging areas, but we really need to use methods like telemetry, where you catch an individual, put a little tag on it, and you track them back to their roost. And so because we couldn't do both types of these in this study, so all the results from here on that I'm going to talk about have to do with foraging sites and what bats need for foraging at night. So across the study, we surveyed 132 sites, all shown there in the circles in the figure. You can see most of them were between Qualicum Bay and Duncan. There were a few down by Victoria, a few just north of Qualicum Bay, but the vast majority were in this kind of central part of the island and especially around Nanaimo. Because of our interest in protected areas, we also made sure that these sites were in a mix of protected and unprotected areas. So we had 54 in protected areas, 78 in unprotected areas. The majority of protected areas were either regional parks or municipal parks, but we did have some national wildlife areas, some private sanctuaries like Morel. I think there's one provincial park with Hammer, but most were regional parks or municipal parks. And all of the surveys were done in one of these 3 kinds of habitats. So bats, when they're feeding, they don't like to feed in the middle of the forest because when they're echolocating, it's very difficult for them to echolocate with all that clutter around. So although forest sites are very important for roosting, when they're feeding, they come out to more open areas, not big open areas like we have in the middle of the ocean or anything like that, but edge sites or gaps in the forest. And so all of our surveys were focused in these different types of habitats that are along forest edges or gaps in forest. And one of the things we wanted to know is, does it matter, or do they differentiate in their preference depending on whether it's an anthropogenic type of opening, like a really fresh clear cut, or a power line corridor, a natural opening, like the bluffs you see that are common here on the east part of the island, or wetlands, like this photo here from Caudle Lake. I'll show you the results for how their preference at the end, but all of the surveys were conducted in one of those 3 habitat types. And so the details of the survey, so we used these ultrasonic recorders that are active from sunset to sunrise, and they're active from May 20 to July 10. And the way these, so this is an example of a recorder here on the left, and just showing how they were placed at some of the sites. This isn't one of our sites, but this is, we placed them on a pole or a tree just out from the edge, depending on what was available at the site. And so these recorders are always listening, and they're set to make a recording when a noise or something passes that is calling at a frequency greater than 15 kilohertz, or higher than 15 kilohertz. And the vast majority of cases, those are bats. And sometimes they pick up birds if it's a very high frequency part of a bird call or a frog. Sometimes rain can trigger it. But for the most part, when we get these recordings, these are from bats, 95% of the cases. And so across all of those 132 sites, and we used 3 nights per site for analysis, we ended up with just under 121,000 bat recordings during the 3-year study. So to show you a bit about, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we know what species are at a site from these recordings. So this is an example here of a bat call spectrogram, and what those shapes are examples of different species calls when they're moving through the environment searching for insects. And so they're cruising through and they're echolocating, and different species, depending on how they feed, have different call shapes. And this is how we identify what species are actually at the site. So one of the most important things that we look for is the frequency of the call, shown here on the left. So the bats here on the island vary from the hoary bat, which has a frequency of around a minimum of around 18 kilohertz, up to about 23 kilohertz, up to some of the myotis like Yuma myotis or California myotis, which can have frequencies higher than 50 kilohertz. So the first thing we're doing is we're looking at what is the frequency of the call on the recordings. Then we can look a little bit finer, among some species with more similar frequencies. We can look at things like the duration of the call. We can look at the shape of the call. So you can see the big variety of shapes there. Some of them are much longer with much more curved shapes. Some of them are much steeper. And so all of these characteristics help us and also help the program to come up with assignments for what bat is actually on the recording. So I'll give you a couple actual examples. So this is an output from one of our sites. This is what it looks like when we process it through. I use a program called Kaleidoscope Pro. It runs through all of the recordings and comes up with an assignment for what species it thinks is at the site based on those different features. So this is a silver-haired bat. This is a fairly distinctive one. And so what we're looking at, you probably won't be able to read it, but the little box there on the bottom is a statistical output of the sampling all of those little calls. Those are like compressed view bat calls in the middle there. And it's sampling all of those, and it's giving me a frequency, a duration, an average frequency, an average duration. And so I don't think you can see it, but the average of all these is 27.55, that FC there in the bottom. The average duration of the call is 12.10. And so this is helping us identify, first of all, say that it's not one of the myotis species because it's too low. Because it's 27.55, that's too high for hoary bat. So this is helping us narrow in on what species is there. And this, we would conclude from this, okay, silver-haired bat present at the site. Just to show you one other example that's very different. This is a Yuma myotis call. In this case, the frequency is 50.57. So one of only 2 species that ends up with a frequency that's so high. It's either Yuma or California myotis. And in this case, they have quite a unique shape. I don't know if you can see how it kind of comes down and does this like sharp jog, that inflection. That is a diagnostic kind of feature that Yuma myotis has that the very similar California myotis does not. And so that's another, we would conclude from this that this is a Yuma myotis at the site. So I won't run through all of them, but I did want to just kind of show you a couple of examples of what's actually kind of happening behind the scenes to figure out what species are at these locations. Now, unfortunately, you cannot identify every bat call. There's many of them that overlap. Those two I showed you were really diagnostic, clear examples. More often we have to, for analyses, we have to group them together into similar frequency groups. Yeah.
Question about the frequencies.
Yeah.
Are they differentiated according to the prey that they have? For example, one frequency would be a particular kind of insect.
More how they feed. So the frequencies, for example, there's species that will use more of they'll pick it, insects off of leaves, for example, and they tend to have very steep calls, and they tend to be higher frequency versus some of the other ones, like a hoary bat, for example, is they have large species. It's kind of cruising through open areas. It's sending out these very long, kind of lower frequency calls. So it does actually vary among species in terms of the frequency and in terms of the insects they're eating, but not so much within a species. That's clear. They will adjust the call. One of the challenges when doing this is that you want these recorders out in open areas, because as soon as they get in more cluttered environments, as they get really closer inside the forest, then they have to change their calls. Then they start sending out these really steep calls, and almost all species look the same. So they are adjusting the call shape a little bit depending on the environment, and then the species themselves differ a lot depending on how they feed and what kinds of prey they're eating. So a little later when I show you the results, I'll more often show it in terms of these groups, because there are so many calls on the recordings that we do have to assign to groups. We cannot definitively say, we can say it's California or Yuma, but we cannot separate them. And so I'm going to be talking about those groups later. But these are the 5 that can be differentiated. Okay, so moving to some of the results. So what this is an overview of the occurrence and relative abundance based on the number of calls we're getting from kind of most frequent and highest abundance in the top left to least frequent, lowest relative abundance, and the bottom right. The first number under each species is the percent of sites where we detected the species out of those 132 sites. The second number is the number of recordings that the program, that kaleidoscope, assigned to a species. Now it's not exact. It does make mistakes sometimes, and as I mentioned, a lot of times you cannot separate them. But having gone through thousands of these myself, I think this is a pretty good representation of the relative abundance of these different species in the Nanaimo area. And so little brown myotis, remember this is the endangered one in eastern, because of what's happened in eastern Canada, is by far the most abundant one at the sites we surveyed. So there were almost 36,000 assigned calls based on for those sites. California myotis and silver-haired bat also very frequent, not quite as abundant as little brown myotis. When we get some of these sites and there's like 1,000 or more calls per night, it's almost always because of high activity of little brown myotis. Whereas California and silver-haired, they're actually present at slightly higher numbers or percentage of sites, but never quite as abundant at those sites. Then we have a few species that are more intermediate in abundance: hoary bat, Yuma myotis, long-eared myotis, and big brown bat. And long-legged myotis, I put a little asterisk there. This is one species that's particularly challenging to identify. We ended up with 23 and almost 24% of sites that they were detected at, and an estimate of 1,700 calls. I think that's probably an underestimate, because it's very hard to separate them from one of the types of calls that little brown myotis uses, and little browns are so much more common. So that's a challenging one. That's probably a little bit more abundant than what's shown there. And then finally, Townsend's big-eared bat. This is was the least common. This is a very soft calling species. Very easy to identify, but they have these soft calls. You only ever pick up 1 or 2, and only at a small percentage of sites. I think they are the least common species in the region. So I thought I'd run through a few of the specific sites since I know this group does a lot of work and there's a lot of interest in some of in the different areas here. So Morel Sanctuary, very productive site. We had a recorder in all years actually at the northwest end of the lake. And on average, we're getting about 1,300 calls a night from that, based on that site. Again, this is mainly little brown myotis, probably about 70 to 80% of those calls. But we had 7 species detected at the site. And so in each of these, when all of the bolded species are the ones that were present, the light gray are the ones that were not detected. But Morel, yeah, very productive area. Yellow Point Bog, we had surveys done at one of the 2 bogs at the site, one of the wetlands. Again, very productive area. The whole cedar area has lots of bats. It's excellent habitat for bats. And 6 species detected at that site. So this time we had long-eared myotis, but we didn't have big brown or long-legged. Lindley Valley had lots of recorders set up in Lindley Valley. This is the one from Caudle Lake. Had an average about 500 calls at Lindley per night. 6 different species identified there. You'll notice in these that those 4 hoary, silver-haired, little brown in California are almost always at every site. Mount Benson, there's really nice little wetland high up on Mount Benson that you've probably been to, about 800 meters. So I thought I'd show this as kind of one of the high elevation sites that we had. 400 calls per night almost, and again, 5 different species at that site. Buttertubs Marsh, 5 species, including those main 4. Again, 3 of them are endangered or soon to be. About 200 calls per night, so not as many as the other sites. It is a more urban area. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but still a good site with 5 species detected there. And then finally, Richards Marsh. I included this one because it's one of the few here in Nanaimo where we had a Townsend's big-eared bat. And so, but as well as 5 other species and about 400 calls per night. So, yeah, so just in terms of general, real areas that are really productive, I mentioned the cedar area. It's lots and lots of bats. All of our sites in cedar has a lot of species and a lot of abundance. I didn't show any here from the Neuse Bay, but that's another area that had lots of bats around Enos Lake, and in that area. And then up around Morel Sanctuary too, lots up in that region as well. Okay. Talk a little bit now about what we found in terms of habitat use. So what is important for bats here on the island? So this comes from the same surveys, but now we're looking more specifically at research questions. So the first one we want to know is, how does the area that they're feeding, or how does their activity differ depending on these 3 kinds of local habitat types, whether they're anthropogenic sites like clear cuts, bluffs, or wetlands? And the main highlight take home here is that wetlands are super important, especially for myotis. So what this and the next slide show here are each of the habitat classes along the bottom, and then relative abundance, which is number of calls, which can be used as a measure of relative abundance as long as you're consistent, which we were in this study. And then for the little brown myotis group on the left and the long-legged myotis, and the California/Yuma myotis group on the right. And so activity of little browns and long-legged is about 10 times higher at wetlands than at either of those other 2 non-wetland sites, which didn't really differ. Even a little bit lower in the bluffs compared to anthropogenic sites. And then similarly, California and Yuma myotis together about 6 times more abundant at these wetland sites compared to the non-wetlands. So wetlands are very important for myotis. Not quite, it's similar, but a little different for the silver-haired bat, hoary bat, big brown bat group. They are still significantly more abundant at wetland sites, but they also quite often use those meadow bluffs. So for myotis, they don't really seem to prefer them. They're always looking for wetlands, but this group definitely does use them. And especially big brown bat, if you actually look more specifically at what species are contributing to these patterns. And then, so it's significantly higher activity at bluffs compared to, say, anthropogenic sites. So wetlands, very important for to protect. So the second question we wanted to look at is, okay, we have an idea on how important these different local sites are. How much does it matter how much forest cover is around these areas in terms of whether they're actually using them? And to demonstrate this, I've shown here two sites. This is Morel location on the left and the Butter Tubs on the right. And so Morel is an example of a fairly high, a site that still has a lot of forest cover on the site. I think it's about 65 to 70%. Butter Tubs, excellent marsh, but there's a lot of urban area around it. It's only about 20 to 25%. So how much what kind of a difference does that make? Because when I showed those examples before, I mean, there was a lot more activity at Morel, for example, than Butter Tubs. And so what we see here, so these slides show the proportion of forest cover within a 2-kilometer radius around all of our sites, along the X here, and then along the Y is relative abundance. And this first shows for those two groups. And so what you can see here in both of these cases is they like kind of intermediate levels of forest cover. They don't, when it's very low, around 20, 30, 40% forest cover, activity is pretty low. It increases up to around 65%. I think that maximum is about 67% forest cover. That's preferred for little browns and long-leggeds. It's around 64%, and not quite as strong for the other group. But you can see that they both show this curvilinear pattern with this preference for intermediate amounts of forest cover around their sites. It's a similar pattern here for the silver-haired hoary big brown group, but a little bit less. They like even a little bit more open areas. So they're looking for sites of about 50% forest cover within 2 kilometers. And so the reason I think we see this is back to that slide where I talked about their habitat needs, is they really have these two needs. They need roost sites. And they need feeding sites. And the roost sites, the natural roost sites, are forests. Many of them will also use anthropogenic sites. They end up in attics, but for example, but they roost in forests. So that's where the forest is providing the roost site, but they don't like feeding inside forests because it's too difficult. So they're moving out from the forest into these open areas. And so this combination of about 50, but more often 65, 70% forest cover mixed with wetlands is really high productive bat habitat. And so that's what's kind of I think is generating this pattern for all of those. There's one species that doesn't show that relationship, and that's the long-eared myotis. This is more of a gleaning species where we see increasing relative abundance at sites with increasing forest cover. So they're not looking for these semi-open landscapes, it seems. They want forest cover. And they are a species that more often gleans in forest. They're not out in the middle of gaps quite as much, so that it does fit with their biology. And then the third question that we wanted to show you here is, what is the difference between bat activity inside versus outside protected areas? And this effect is not quite as distinct as those other two, the first two questions I showed you there. But when we look at all of the myotis, so all 5 of those species, we do see about a 50% higher abundance inside protected areas. So they are helping to protect bats. There's definitely greater use of the protected sites than the unprotected sites. This is probably a combination of taller and more forest, older forest, and wetlands, I suspect, is that they're protecting and offering those kind of habitats that bats need. So just go summarize some of the results here. So the survey showed a high occurrence and relative abundance, and especially of species at risk. This is an area that still has a lot of little brown myotis, a lot of silver-haired bat, a lot of hoary bats. And remember from the start, these are 3 species that are in trouble and that there's a lot of interest for in Canada. So the Nanaimo region is supporting good numbers of these species. Wetlands, very important foraging sites for all species, but especially the Myotis group, but meadow bluffs are also often frequently used by silver-haired hoary and big brown bats. So those are important as well for their conservation. Many species prefer intermediate levels of forest cover in the landscape. It's probably offering that combination of roost sites and feeding sites that they like. The only exception being long-eared Myotis. And there is a higher relative abundance of Myotis in general in protected than unprotected areas. So I'm going to close after this just by a few things that everybody can do for bat conservation. But I do first want to spend a bit of time on acknowledgements. Many people are very helpful. Many thanks for with this survey. So collaborators, Amy Wilson, Linda Burmans, and Simon Gamboa. Most protected areas didn't require permits, but a few that did, those individuals shown there helped get permits to access the sites. And then many private landowners that very helpfully allowed us to use the sites, in many cases actually helped collect the data for us. That was super helpful and really appreciate those contributions as well. So finally, what can everybody do to support bat conservation? And there's lots of things we can do. So one, participate in monitoring initiatives that help conduct colony counts or trend monitoring, for example, with the North American Bat Monitoring Program. So one thing that I've done here is Kathy Doyle does a bat census out at North Oyster Community Center. As one example of a community count that you can participate in. It's a lot of fun. Go out, keep track of bat numbers in these colonies, and there's a lot of these. So that's one way that everybody can get out and be engaged and help with bat monitoring. Support efforts to protect bat maternity roosts and hibernacula. Hibernacula are the winter sites. I didn't really talk about that, but that's really important. And this can include bat boxes and bat hotels. That question often comes up. It needs to be done carefully and shouldn't be done at the expense of natural roosts, but they can be a benefit for bats if they're done carefully. And the Bat Community Program that Linda leads here in the Nanaimo region helps provide guidance on bat hotels and bat boxes. If anybody's interested, we can get in touch with them to talk more about that. You saw those results. Wetlands are very important for bats. We need to protect wetlands. We also need to make sure we protect forest cover around wetlands. It didn't talk about this, but unfortunately, domestic cats kill a lot of bats, in addition to birds and amphibians and everything. So supporting no free roaming policies for domestic cats, like they have here in Nanaimo, there is a policy against free roaming. That can really help protect bats because, yeah, sadly, there's a lot of bat predation by cats. And then finally, bat-friendly yards. There's lots of bats here in the city. We have them in our yard every night. Supporting good, nice yards, lots of vegetation, no pesticides, lots of insects. Whoops. Did there, but that was the end of it anyway. Oh, there we go. Can help support bats within your own on your own properties, and so it's a lot. I love seeing bats in the yard, flying around at dusk, and get the recorder out and see what they are, and so it's fun. So yeah. All right. Thanks very much.
Okay. Very lots of questions. I'll just turn on.
Steam sites in the forest, will these be tree cavities, like affiliated woodpeckers opening up a tree or something, or is it something other than that?
Yeah, they would use those, or like old cedar snags are really important roost sites for bats. I don't remember if you saw the talk by Chris there. He gave a talk, but at Nalt in November, and he was talking about the value of old snags for bats, for bat roosting. And so that's yeah, large old trees for at least for the colonial ones. Some of those more solitary ones like hoary bats and silver-haired bats, they more get up into these big Douglas firs, for example, and they get in under the bark. That's the kind of roost sites they use. So it's a mix, but in general, big old trees and snags, the dead trees are what they're looking for in forest for roost sites. Yeah.
Very different than cave sites.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, some of our bats. We really don't know what they use actually for hibernacula in winter. Some of them are probably.
It's a little closer.
Oh, it's getting too far away, sorry. Some of them are using a mix of caves and probably mines and old trees for hibernating in winter. It's still so poorly known. We're gonna have to do more work to identify what kinds of winter sites they're using for hibernating. But yeah, in general, there isn't a lot of evidence that they use these big caves like we see out east, where there's thousands and thousands of them in caves.
Guess that means less risk for the fungal diseases.
Yeah, hopefully that's kind of the thought, is that if they're not in these, the combination of not being in such large colonies and also warmer winter temperatures is probably not as risky. Some of them are actually active here in winter. So
Well, no, I was gonna say, like
Yeah.
in eastern North America, if you go south, it gets
Mhm.
warmer.
Mhm.
So is there evidence in eastern North America that white
Yeah.
nose syndrome isn't?
It's not as severe down in the southeast.
Okay, where it's
Yeah,
warmer,
it's more, it's in the cold areas, yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. There's species like California myotis and silver-haired bat that are regularly out in the middle of winter. Not feeding like you see in the summer, but they seem to come out every few days. We've got a few recordings and not exactly sure what they're doing. Maybe feeding a little bit, drinking, and then go back to sleep for a few days and get up again. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Sorry, we need a section on different kinds of lights on that.
Sorry, just,
I've seen that flying around for the moss and things.
Yeah. Yeah, they will. I don't know if there's any negative effect of that. Because lights attract moths, they may frequently go out and feed near them. I haven't heard of anything where there's any kind of a negative effect of lights like that.
Affect predation.
Yeah, it could. Owls will
Yeah,
predate that. Or cats, if they're feeding in lights near people's houses, for instance, and get down low enough where a cat might get them, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, I guess Stefan first, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, so when you place the monitoring, like the song meters, what effect does sort of different sites have, like if you put it close to the water or away from the water?
Yeah, we tried to be really consistent so that it's out from the edge of the forest a little bit, because the forest introduces some clutter and the bats, as I mentioned, will call a bit differently. The one thing you have to watch out for with water is that you get this bounce effect. If you're setting them, you have to, because when a bat's coming along, if it's the recorder's positioned at about this height and the bat's flying along, it calls. It also calls and it bounces off the water. And you get this really weird, kind of cluttered, messy call that hits the recorder at the same time. So you have to sort of watch out. That's one of the things you have to watch out for if you place them near water. Usually I was actually trying to look for sites where there's some kind of vegetation in the water that helps prevent the bounce. But if it's like flat and the record is at about 6 feet, 5-6 feet, yeah, you get that problem. It's quite common. Yeah.
For monitoring, you're distinguishing between different kinds of bats.
Mhm.
Does it distinguish between individual bats? So can you say that this one's like a larger one or a smaller one? I mean, just as an example. Because you're not really, it could be that one bat is calling, I mean, this may sound like a stupid question, 10 times a night and one is.
Exactly, yeah.
So how do you figure that out?
Yeah, so that's why it always has to be considered as activity or relative abundance. We don't know how many bats are actually at the site. There's been some work to try to solve that, and I don't remember the number, but where a certain number of calls is thought to represent a certain number of bats using the site. I can't remember what the numbers are. But it is an issue because we just have the recordings. You're right, we could be the same one. It could be doing that, yeah. The idea here is as long as the protocol is the same, then it's a reasonable measure of relative abundance when you're comparing between sites, for example. Even if you can't tell exactly how many are
And
calling.
how was that program determined? So how did they figure out which sound was which bat? Was there, did they have them in a lab and then?
Yeah.
Like, how did they figure that out?
That's one way. There's another method. I've never done this, but it's called kiting. So when a bat, because a lot of bat work has been done with where bats are caught in mist nets for before acoustic recordings. That was the main way to do it. You catch the bat and you have it in your hand, so you know exactly what it is. And then when you release it, you have it on a long string and it's releasing and it's calling and you're making recordings and you get these, you can figure out what the call is because you know what the species is because you just had it in your hand. So that's one way to do it.
Long street.
A long string. Yeah. And they, yeah, basically, yeah. And then they bring it back in and then they release it off and let it go. But then you've gotten a bunch of recordings of a known species that then helps these programs when they process samples to know what it is. Yeah. I don't remember the order here.
Can one get such a gadget for one's home to keep the bats in your garden?
Yeah, there's a version of the program I was using, Kaleidoscope Pro, that you can get for your iPhone. And it just, yeah, you just plug it into the phone and bat is calling and it processes it and gives you suggestions on what it is. I can't remember what it's, what's it called? Echo meter, yeah.
Stefan and I both have one, and we're gonna do an outing like a strange creatures of the night outing or something. I guess we can do it in the winter, but I was thinking more in the summer, but
Then, yeah, you might get some of
but
it.
anytime, yeah.
Yeah.
Just, there's a question on chat here from Circa, any idea about species-specific home ranges? Why did you stop recording in July? Circa has done a 4-year study in the Cowichan Coxsackie watershed, what to do with our data? Any central archive for bat work? How do your habitat types compare to urban areas and other subhabitats?
Yeah, so okay, why did we stop in July? That was because we wanted to do get recordings before the pups were out and flying around. So this was because then that if we had that mix, then you've got the mix of the breeders and then all of a sudden all these young juveniles. So that was the reason to stop in July. Sorry, what were some of the other ones?
Well, they did some work, they collected some data in Cowichan Coxsackie watershed, and they wanted to know what to do with their data. Was there a central archive for bat work?
I don't think so. What do you, Linda? You might know better than me. Yeah, no, there's
Just Google the community bat program and
probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe get in touch with Corey Lawson or Mandy Kellner. I think,
If we submitted to like the provincial wildlife survey data system online, and then it would just, then at least it goes into sort of the provincial long-term data set.
so there's a provincial.
Well, that would be detection data after it's been processed, so it's a bit, I don't know, I would assume they have some kind of species detection data that they can submit.
Okay. Anyway.
yeah.
What wildlife acoustics recorder model did you use?
I think it's called the SM4 Mini Bat, if I remember right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know if I answered all of those, but we'll go to maybe.
Yeah,
the room
yeah,
for-
yeah.
yeah.
Might be a stupid question, forgive me, but bat-friendly yards, I understand the no pesticides,
Yeah.
but where the species on the island are insectivores, how does the vegetation assessed?
How is the vegetation assessed? You mean?
Assessed in the bat-friendly yards and in promoting, in supporting bat.
Oh, I just think when you have vegetation in the yard for a couple things, you might actually get them roosting in the yard. I do think we have a California myotis that regularly roosts in our yard if you have larger trees, for example, like cedars. But the vegetation just promotes higher insect activity and abundance. So, yeah, lots of shrubs and flowering shrubs, and it just helps the insect abundance, and that brings bats in and gives them similar to bees, for example. So yeah, that too just helps.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
in banded or, do you put tracers on them or?
Yeah, you can ban bats. I've never done it myself, but there are programs that misnet and ban bats if you wanted to track them, you know, their survival over time, for example. It's not as common as bird banding, I guess.
That's how you could find where they're hibernating.
Yeah, exactly. That's so usually when they'll ban them and then they'll put a little like transmitter that is glued on. It'll last about 3 weeks and you can track them to where they're going. That's the most common way to find out where their roost sites are. And so yeah, really important work. I'd like to do more of it here in the island to figure out these sites. Yeah, finding the hibernacula can be a bit tricky depending on where they go, because if they're tagged with a telemetry unit and then they end up going down into a mine or a cave, you lose it as soon as they've gone down underground. Whereas it's not quite as big an issue with roosting in trees. You can still find them when they're in the trees. Yeah, we need more of that information for sure. Can be quite long. 20 years. Yeah, you think of bats and you think of like flying mice, but they're really not like where, you know, they produce lots of young and they die after a year or two. It's not like that at all. Bats are very long lived. They have high survival and they usually only produce one young every year. So that's also a reason why it's when you see these population crashes from white nose, and it's unfortunate because it takes them so long to recover if they're only producing one pup a year. Because that level of mortality, or when cats get them or whatever, it's not natural for them. There's not a lot of natural predation or mortality in bats. And so these threats like white nose have a really big impact on them. It takes a long time to recover. Yeah. Okay.
So is there any disease surveillance for white nose?
Yes, yeah, a lot actually. I'm not doing it, but the BC, the province, I mean, I think all of the provinces are monitoring white nose and what are some of the methods they use to do that? I haven't been involved, but.
Go ahead. No, I'm really part, I think there's like swabs and stuff
Yeah.
that they do to test for it.
Right, yeah, there's definitely, yeah, but in general, there's definitely a lot of active monitoring of white nose.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think in 2024, they took over 400 swabs at different sites all around BC and back then.
All negative in 2024. Oh, even in where they've been found in. Oh, that's good sign. Yeah, good. Okay. Yes.
I was wondering how far the recording units, what's the detection radius of the recording units for the bats that have to come within?
It's a good question. It depends on the species, really. A very loud calling species like hoary bat, I want to say I could probably pick it up at least 50 meters, maybe more. Some of the really soft calling ones like Townsend's big-eared bats probably have to get really close, within maybe 10 meters. So yeah.
Would that affect, be considered an impact on the numbers there and why the Townsend's
Yeah.
is so low?
Definitely, yeah. So Townsend, I think most other evidence suggests that they're a really very uncommon bat anyway. But definitely they are, they're easy to identify. They are hard to pick up though. And so they're not that, looking at those numbers, some of that is going to be influenced by how loudly a species calls. Yeah.
I'm just thinking a little bit about prey availability and the different habitat types that you outlined. And thinking about in an urban environment, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume even if you had the same, I don't know how you distinguish different types of, like, do you have different types of forest cover, or are you just saying the green space consists of forest cover? I would just assume that there's less prey available to that in an urban environment versus.
I think so, yeah, and I think that's part of what's contributing to some of those differences in sites and why the more rural areas are more productive. There is more forest. It's kind of related. If there's more forest, there's going to be more prey as well compared to a lot of urban infrastructure. Yeah.
And agricultural land, did you consider that anthropogenic?
Yeah, I did only, it would be nice to separate out like, their use of like clear cut versus crop fields. We hardly had any fields, so they were pooled in there, but I think there were only 2 or 3. Almost all of those that were anthropogenic, the majority were young clear cuts and a few power line corridors, which are similar, yeah. Yeah. We do have another study, actually, I'll just briefly mention, over in the Alaxon National Wildlife Area over on the mainland. So we've actually been looking at bat abundance and occurrence along in those hedgerow strips in different areas of different agricultural intensity. And different sort of quality of hedgerows. I won't get into the details of that, but just to mention that that's another study we had ongoing at the same time to understand bat use of agricultural areas in the lower mainland.
Okay. Oh, and well, then one of the questions here was about, that original question was about habitat, like home range size, I guess, species specific home range sizes, like what would be? maybe-
Yeah, they can be very large, like hoary bats can go up to 5 kilometers looking
Oh.
for feeding areas.
That's all.
Same, I think with Townsend's big-eared, well, they use more of a linear kind of foraging, they'll forage along river valleys, for instance, but yeah, it can be kilometers. Less so for some of those little ones. I think when you get those really productive sites with little brown myotas, I think it's likely that the roost sites are not too far. We're probably within a kilometer, I would think. But they can travel a long ways to feeding areas.
And the Townsends with those huge ears and the soft calls, are they feeding on large?
Yeah, they're
Noisy
they're
moths, I don't know.
moth specialists. Yeah,
Okay, big moth specialists.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Sure.
Did you do something around Cameron Lake and Cathedral Groves?
Yeah, have you had one at Cathedral Grove? Yeah.
Did
It's,
you notice the more of them maybe because of the old growth?
It was a productive site, yeah. We had one in the sort of the bay at the very west end of Cameron Lake, right adjacent to Cathedral Grove. Wouldn't say no, I mean, it was a good site, no more than something like Yellow Point or Morel or Enos Lake, but it was a good, yeah, it's a productive site. I imagine those old growth trees at Cathedral Grove must have a few colonies in there. Yeah. Good. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, I
Oh,
was just gonna say to you, like, if most of productivity, or is more productivity associated with wetlands, is that because, like, you suspect it's mostly insects that are aquatic, like emerging
Yeah, that's probably the
insects?
big thing.
So there, the forest is, like you say, if it's for roosting,
Mhm.
then the wetlands, actually producing the food.
For those, especially for those species, like little brown myotis and Yuma myotis regularly feed at wetlands, more so than many of the others. So there's almost more like,
Right.
they all like wetlands. There's some that are especially wetland specialists. Yeah.
Okay, and just see. I think I may have missed some questions in there, but anyway, thanks to everyone on Zoom. Thank you very much. Oh. And we have we had a raffle that I'm sure all you guys bought tickets for, and we'll ask Scott to draw a winning.
So just to let you know, Julie Devereaux offered this book to us. It's very recent from 2023. She highly recommends it. It's about owls. And yeah, it's going to be great for one of you
Night
that
birds, that's good.
generously gave some money for the fund.
Even though owls eat bats.
Even though what?
Well, they're nighttime things, you know.
Okay, so would you mind?
Sure.
To get
Read the number, is that?
Yeah, the last
I'm
3
ready.
numbers over here.
Okay, last 3, 199.
Woohoo. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
I knew it. You know when you feel something?
So what we're doing for you, I mean,
I only have two
tomorrow.
questions.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah.
So the current area behind the website is needed for accessibility sources.
Yeah, wetlands are productive. Especially those species that.
Are you gonna send out emails about those things or?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.